Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Haynes Johnson, who will give the 2009 commencement address. As you have all just heard, Haynes is a respected journalist, author, and historian who has reported on virtually every major national and international news event in the past 4 decades. We are honored by his presence. Please join me in welcoming Professor Haynes Johnson.
President Kunkel, distinguished faculty, honored family, guests, friends, and you, the graduates, congratulations, because this is your day, and nothing in the days and years to come will diminish your memories of this moment. You made it, so enjoy it, savor it, celebrate for all it's worth, and whatever comes next, it's worth a great deal. This is your day to remember and to cherish. When President Kunkel paid me the honor of addressing you today, I began thinking about what possible message I could convey that went beyond the usual bromides and cliches that adorn so many, dare I say most, commencement addresses. You know, this is your moment. We're counting on you to remake the world anew. To you, we pass the torch. Let the flowers bloom and the good times roll, and on and on and on. In that respect, I was amused last week to read in Newsweek a preview of upcoming commencement addresses. When they are bad, and I'm quoting, they're really bad. Tedious, disposable swamps of words aimed at tuned-out, hungover audiences. Surely not in this forum here today. In sweaty polyester robes. End of quotes. The magazine did add that, and again I'm quoting, when they're great, they stick for a lifetime. And among the very few great such addresses they cited was George Marshall's famous one 62 years ago, when in the aftermath of World War II and the horrors of that period, he unveiled what became known as the Marshall Plan that committed the United States to forge a bipartisan approach to rebuild the war-torn world, and particularly to rebuild our former enemies of Germany and Japan. An action that literally saved the free world and prevented far greater calamities in the most threatening new atomic age. They cited one more memorable address. Just a year ago, Barbara Kinsolving spoke at Duke at the ceremonies in words that now seem prescient. She warned that graduates that, quote, you'll see things collapse in your time, the big houses, the empires of glass, the new green things that sprout up through the wreck. These will be yours. Since then, Wall Street has collapsed. Many of the greatest financial houses are either gone or merged. The automobile industry, symbol of America's manufacturing prowess, is teetering on extinction, and the economy continues to sink amidst the greatest losses since the Great Depression, nearly 3/4 of a century ago. Make no mistake, the conditions all of you and all of us now confront are historic by any measure. Turn on any TV or Radio 2 station, or pick up what remains of a dying newspaper industry, which I spent my life and my father before me, and you're instantly bombarded with dire reports. In just the last few days, you would have encountered grim reports like these. Page 1, New York Times, headline, slump creates crack of mobility for Americans, fear that the decline may further slow us in the U.S. economy. Page 1, Wall Street Journal, headline, the curse of the class of 2009. For college grads likely enough to get work this year, low wages are likely to haunt them for a decade or more. If that's not enough to make you head for the hills, here's some more culled from the latest news reports. Since World War II, 10 post-war recessions have averaged 10.4 months in length, with the longest being 16 months. The current recession is in its 17th month, and the labor market is still shredding over 600,000 jobs a month, and more than 13 million Americans are now officially counted as unemployed, with 6 million jobs lost since the recession began. And that's not even addressing the problems of our having to fight 2 wars, deal with an age of terrorism, threats from places like Iran and North Korea, plus the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And oh yes, we've now seen the reemergence of pirates to challenge our supremacy on the seas. And how about their warnings that we face the potential of a worldwide swine flu pandemic? With all of this, how dare I come before you today with a message of unbridled, and I mean really unbridled, optimism about the future. I say that because the difficult times we face are not unique. The United States has endured and prevailed over many graver crises in decades past. I have every confidence we will do so again, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But first, if you'll bear with me for a moment, I want to share some personal memories. For what I'm about to say comes from someone who's been trying in recent days, literally trying, to put myself in your place. That is, to remember what it was like when I got my undergraduate degree eons ago. I mean, must have been back in Lincoln's period, I don't know. In any event, that was 1952. The Korean War had become an unmitigated disaster after Chinese communist forces intervened and began pushing American forces back and back until they almost literally were driven into the South China Sea in total defeat. The times are so grim then, and the American need for immediate infusion of fresh new military troops so great that the government administered tests to all male collegiate students across the United States that spring. And this is something I've never seen noted since then, but it did happen because I was there. Those who got the highest scores were exempt from going immediately into service. Those who were not were drafted and sent to Korea. The rest of us were permitted to stay and finish our college work before graduating. When our time came, months later, most of us went into the service, either as draftees or volunteers. I will never forget how after my 16 weeks of infantry basic training in the snows of Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, I had been picked to go on to officer candidate school and was sent home for a Christmas vacation break. At the same time, many of my fellow trainees were not given any leave. Instead, they were flown directly from the U.S. to the front lines in Korea while I was enjoying my holiday Christmas vacation at home with my family. Some of those friends of mine were killed that very time in combat. I still feel bitter, I will confess, over how they were treated as mere expendable cannon fodder, but that's what it was. 3 years later, after my own service, I became a graduate student in American history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, an institution I revere. The Cold War was still at its most fearsome, McCarthyism was in vogue, and Joe McCarthy of nearby Appleton never dared directly to take on the University of Wisconsin, but I remember he did make a critical address about it during my first graduate semester there, saying that even the eminent University of Wisconsin boasted of how it possessed the greatest collection of communist literature in its historical society, including original documents from Stalin and Lenin and others. The morning after Joe's remarks, naturally the reporters pressed the university's chancellor. Was what McCarthy said true? What did the chancellor have to say about it? The chancellor simply said, yes, it was true, and we intend to increase our resources. End of story. I hasten to add, the chancellor's point was not that Wisconsin was seeking to indoctrinate its students into becoming young communists, but to make available the basic material for students and scholars to learn and be better prepared to enter a world divided between forces of democracy and communism. My point, too, is not to recall old war stories. Surely they're even more boring than many commencement addresses. But to remind you that in past times of immense difficulty, Americans have always risen to their challenges. But enough of the past. Here's why I'm optimistic about the future, and especially about you in this graduating class. For the past 2.5 years, I've been laboring on a narrative history of the 2008 presidential election. Not because I wanted to do another book, it's my 15th, but because I was convinced this past election had the potential to be one of the most important in our history because everything in our national life was up for grabs. Even more, it is proven to be one of the most important, and more than that. More than an endurance test for the candidates, it was a test of the American people and their institutions. Now that it's part of history, what lessons can we learn from it? The first, most obviously, involves race. Since 1619, when a battered Dutch privateer beat around Camp Henry, tacked slowly up the James River, and dropped anchor off Jamestown to deposit the first African-American slaves in America, race relations have affected the character of the United States more than any other factory. Black slaves laid the cornerstone for the White House and the Capitol, were sold like chattel in a huge slave market that stood on the site in Washington where today the National Archives now houses the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Slavery became the source of bloodshed, civil war, discord, discrimination that plagued the nation throughout its history, dishonoring its professed democratic principles of equality. I myself, if I may talk more personally, have witnessed in places like Selma, Alabama, blacks being clubbed to the ground and some murdered, merely in the attempt to walk a few blocks to the courthouse to register to vote, not to spark a revolution, just to register to vote. So whatever happens in Barack Obama's presidency, whether it's judged a success or a failure, his election as the first African-American president will always form a proud chapter in the American story. So too with the campaign of Hillary Clinton, and yes, Sarah Palin too, Tina Fey notwithstanding. It showed that another scourge of American democracy, another blight, along with racism, sexism, at the very least, is diminishing in our society. The cause of women's rights, especially their political rights, has been advanced. The glass ceiling has not been shattered, but it is certainly less secure, and it comes at a time when women have assumed far more vital roles in American society. Women today represent the greatest percentage of those attending college. And I noticed at breakfast this morning in the Green Bay paper, it cited the graduation ceremonies of the University of Wisconsin graduates yesterday there, and it said that 69% of the undergraduates were women, 80% of the graduate degrees were women. So it's your time, go grab it as you go forward. And it's true that what we see in the role of women in the professions, from lawyers to doctors to scientists and researchers, they now comprise more than half of those entering those fields. Then there's the role of government itself, all the more critical now because of the economic collapse and the intervention by Washington to fashion a remedy. Economic warning lights were flashing red for months, if not years, before the collapse of the markets. And that raises the far more complex question of what the appointed watchmen were doing during that period. And what was the proper role of government? Not big, small, liberal or conservative government, but government that works. Government in which people have confidence, at the least. The economic confidence that we now seem to have shattered in the public consensus about following a deregulatory model of government. It's not clear whether we want to return to a new era of larger government, or, as I hope, devoutly, to the principles of government as the neutral umpire, one that strives to allow opportunity to flourish, risks to occur, but one which also establishes supervision and regulation to keep the system from self-destructing as it has done recently. And that brings me to you and your role. If I'm right, the United States is at one of those hinge moments in history where a period of reaction and selfishness and corruption is replaced by one of reform, Reform involving healthcare, global warming, environmental perils facing us all, and reform in which your generation, graduates, is destined to play the leading role, just as it was in your generation and the votes of young voters in this election that brought about the political changes we now see being debated in Washington. Debates about striking the proper balance between public and private service. We need both public and private to be successful. We need both to work together, just as we needed the bipartisan spirit that led to the passage of the Marshall Plan so many decades ago. Finally, let me offer as my theme for this address something Franklin D. Roosevelt said upon accepting his party's nomination in the midst of the Great Depression, years of the 30s, and at a time when war clouds were gathering for what would become the bloodiest battles in human history during World War II. Here's what FDR said to that generation of Americans who were about to assume leadership positions. And once more, I quote, "There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. That's your destiny, too, and I'm counting on you to make the most of it and confident you will do so." And I say that for a lot of reasons, not naively, I'm sure, because when I drove around your wonderful campus, this idyllic setting, almost perfect, removed from trouble, the Fox River, beautiful buildings, great campus, and I watched your procession today coming in here, I was thinking to myself, this is exactly the kind of place that you can take from and build a new future and a better time for the country. Because this is an institution that incorporates values, community, service, serving others, and successful for all of us, not just for one of us. So I want to celebrate you and congratulate you, class of 2009. And now, after it's your celebrations, it's time for you to get on with writing the next best chapter of American history for the rest of us. Thank you.